Black Waitress is mocked for her scars, until a veteran is shocked to recognize the unit tattoo. The morning rush at Mason's Diner was always a noisy affair. Silverware clinked against porcelain plates, coffee machines hissed and gurgled, and conversations overlapped in a steady hum. Truckers, salesmen, families, and office workers filled the booths and stools, each absorbed in their little world. The air smelled of fried bacon, syrup, and burnt coffee, the kind of scent that clung to your clothes long after you left. Moving swiftly through the maze of tables was Alana, the waitress everyone knew by name but few truly saw. Her uniform was the same dull white blouse and checkered apron as the others, but no one could ignore the truth that set her apart, the deep scars crawling across her skin. They wrapped around her arms like rivers of flame frozen in time, slashing jagged paths over her hands and even climbing faintly toward her neck. Most people pretended not to look, but pretending was still looking. Alana carried her trays with practiced grace, never spilling, never rushing, never reacting to the whispers she caught from time to time. She had been at the diner for 3 years, long enough to know the unspoken rhythm of judgment. First came the double take, then the lingering glance, then the hurried whisper. Some customers pitted her. Others made up stories about her: burn accident, drugs, prison, gang violence. None of them were true, but Alana had stopped trying to correct people long ago. She wasn't ashamed of her scars. She simply knew that people didn't want the truth. They wanted a spectacle. That morning, a group of businessmen in crisp suits had claimed the large booth near the window. They weren't locals. Their expensive watches and smug laughter marked them as outsiders passing through. Alana approached with her notepad, giving the same polite smile she offered every table. But the men barely looked at the menu. One of them let out a chuckle as his eyes swept over her arms. Another leaned back in his seat, his lips twisting into a smirk. By the time she poured their coffee, the laughter had started. "Damn," one muttered under his breath, but not low enough. "Looks like she went 10 rounds with a lawnmower." The table erupted in chuckles. One of them mimed scratching his arm with an invisible blade, exaggerating a wince. The others laughed harder. Alana's hand trembled for the briefest second, but she steadied it and continued pouring. She didn't flinch, didn't snap back, didn't even give them the satisfaction of meeting their eyes. She had heard worse before. Always from men who thought cruelty made them powerful. Always from people who assumed her silence was weakness. As she walked away, their laughter followed her like an echo. But what the businessman didn't notice, what almost no one noticed, was the faint tattoo that peeked out from beneath the scars on her forearm. The ink was faded, broken in places where the scar tissue tore through it. But the shape was still there. A falcon, its wings stretched wide, claws gripping a dagger. It was the kind of mark that carried weight. A mark that very few outside the military would even recognize. A mark that told a story darker and far more dangerous than anything those men could ever imagine. And in the far corner of the diner, a lone man in a plain jacket sat silently, watching her every move. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't mocking. Because the moment he saw that tattoo, his blood ran cold. He knew exactly what it meant. The laughter at the businessman's table carried on. But Alana hardly heard it anymore. She had trained herself long ago to tune out the noise, to focus on the rhythm of her work, the soft thud of plates against the counter, the hiss of the grill, the scratch of her pencil against the order pad. To outsiders, she looked like a woman immune to cruelty. A waitress too used to mockery to care. But inside, every laugh was a blade. Every smirk was a reminder. And yet, Alana kept moving. She always kept moving. Across the diner, the man in the plain jacket never took his eyes off her. He was older, his hair peppered with grey, his face hardened by lines that spoke of discipline and years of service. He had come in quietly, asked for nothing more than a black coffee, and positioned himself in the farthest booth. He didn't belong to the rowdy noise of the morning crowd. He didn't even belong to this small town. He carried himself like someone who had been through battlefields and never left them behind. When he first noticed the waitress, his gaze had slid over her scars, but not with disgust or curiosity like the others. His eyes had landed on her forearm, on the faint but unmistakable unit tattoo beneath the ruined flesh. And for a moment, time froze. That tattoo wasn't decoration. It wasn't art. It was a symbol only a select few had the right to wear. A falcon gripping a dagger, emblem of a reconnaissance. unit that had been deployed in some of the most dangerous conflicts overseas, a unit that operated in shadows, in places most civilians would never even know existed. The man, Colonel Harris, though no one here knew his name, had served alongside that unit. He remembered the missions, the nights without sleep, the comrades who never returned, and he remembered the ones who carried the falcon. They weren't ordinary soldiers. They were elite, tested, broken down, rebuilt, and forged into something unyielding. So what was their emblem doing on the scarred skin of a waitress in a roadside diner? Harris felt his chest tighten. The ink was damaged, interrupted by burns and cuts, but the outline was unmistakable. Whoever she was, she had earned it, which meant she wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just some woman with scars. She was one of them, or had once been. At the businessman's booth, another round of laughter erupted, drawing disapproving glances from other patrons. Their mockery was loud now, crueler, louder with every sip of coffee. They thought they were untouchable, their laughter a shield against decency. But Harris wasn't listening to them anymore. His focus was on the waitress who moved silently through the diner, carrying more weight in her silence than those men could in their arrogance. The colonel's hand tightened around his coffee cup. He had seen too many good soldiers forgotten, discarded by the very people they had protected. He had seen heroes stripped of their dignity, reduced to shadows of themselves. But here was someone who had clearly carried both fire and steel, who had survived whatever inferno had left those scars. And the men at that table had no idea who they were mocking. Harris leaned back, his eyes narrowing. He remembered operations where one wrong move meant death, where the Falcon unit had stepped in and saved lives, including his own. His memory sharpened on faces from years past. Could it be possible that this scarred waitress had once been there? In those impossible battles? Could she have stood beside them in the dirt, under the fire, carrying the weight of decisions civilians would never imagine? As Alana passed his table, setting down a plate for the booth behind him, Harris caught a closer glimpse. The way she moved, balanced even under heavy trays. Her awareness of the room. The quick scan of exits she made without even realizing it. He recognized it all. That wasn't the instinct of a simple diner worker. That was muscle memory from training drilled into bone. She was hiding in plain sight. And Harris knew one thing with certainty. The men laughing at her now were playing with fire. The businessmen grew louder as the morning wore on, their smugness fueled by coffee refills, and the false confidence of men, who believed no one would ever challenge them. They were successful by the town standards, money in the bank, expensive watches flashing under the diner's flickering lights, and in their minds, that wealth gave them permission to look down on anyone they deemed lesser. Alana became their target. Every time she passed their booth, their voices rose a little louder. Their comments were no longer whispers. They were deliberate, sharp, meant to sting. They spoke of her scars as if she couldn't hear them, compared her to monsters from horror stories, and joked that the diner should issue masks to its servers to keep the customers from losing their appetite. A couple at a corner table shifted uncomfortably, whispering disapproval, but no one dared to say anything. This was the cruel balance of small-town life. People noticed. People cared, but most turned away, afraid to step into conflict. Alana had endured this before. She had endured worse. The burns on her arms, the scars across her cheek, were living proof of pain few could imagine. Compared to that, words should have been nothing. But words cut differently. They weren't searing like fire. They were slow, deliberate knives, reopening wounds she thought had healed. Still, she moved with grace. She balanced plates on her arm, refilled cups, and carried trays as if the noise didn't touch her. But inside, a storm was building. Colonel Harris, from his booth, could feel it. He had seen that look in soldiers, men and women pushed past their limits, pressed against invisible walls until something inside snapped. Alana's jaw was clenched tighter now. Her steps were measured, her back straighter, her silence heavier. The businessmen didn't notice. Or if they did, they didn't care. Their leader, a man with slicked back hair and a voice that carried too far, smirked as Alana leaned over to set down another plate at the booth beside theirs. His voice cut through the diner like a whip. Careful, he drawled loudly enough for everyone to hear. Wouldn't want the freak show to drop someone's breakfast. Laughter followed. Laughter that filled the room. Laughter that rolled through the walls. Laughter that made Alana's chest tighten. She froze for half a second, the plate hovering before her hand steadied. Her eyes flicked up, not at the men, but at the clock on the wall, as if grounding herself, as if reminding herself to keep moving forward. But Harris noticed something else. The scars on her forearm shifted as her muscles tensed. Her free hand curled for just a moment before she forced it flat against her apron. It was a soldier's instinct: restrain, control, measure. He had seen it in combat, when men were provoked but had to hold the line. And then the laughter turned crueler. One of the men leaned across the booth, snatching a napkin and scribbling something on it before tossing it onto the floor near Alana's feet. She glanced at it briefly, but didn't stoop to pick it up. The man laughed louder, nudging his friend, his voice dripping with mockery. "Guess scars don't stop you from thinking you're better than us, huh?" The words hung in the air. The diner grew quieter, the way rooms do when cruelty goes too far, when even bystanders can no longer pretend it's harmless. Alana stood still, her tray now empty, her hands at her sides. She wasn't looking at the men anymore. She wasn't looking at anyone. She was staring at a spot on the floor, eyes distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely. Colonel Harris recognized that look. It was the look of someone pulled back into memories they'd tried to bury, the look of someone who had fought in hell and returned with scars as proof, the look of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, and yet was being mocked by people who would never understand. The colonel set his coffee down, his decision made. The businessmen thought they were safe in their arrogance, laughing at scars they couldn't comprehend. But Harris knew the truth. This woman wasn't weak. She wasn't broken. She wasn't just a waitress. And in a few moments, the men who mocked her would learn just how dangerous their laughter truly was. The air in the diner had changed. It was no longer filled with the easy chatter of morning customers. Instead, it carried a heavy tension, the kind that prickles the skin and tightens the chest. Even the clinking of forks on plates had gone silent. Everyone was waiting. Alana stood rooted, her face calm but her body trembling ever so slightly, the scars on her arms catching the light as her hands flexed against her apron. She looked like someone holding back a tide of emotion so powerful it threatened to drown her. The businessman, oblivious to the shift, kept laughing. Their leader leaned back, stretching his arms wide across the booth, savoring his audience as if he were a performer on stage. "What?" he sneered loudly. "Did we hurt the poor girl's feelings? Come on, sweetheart, it's just a joke. Don't be so sensitive." The words stung, but they no longer mattered. Because in that moment, Colonel Harris pushed himself out of his booth. His tall frame drew every eye in the room. He moved slowly, deliberately, his military bearing unmistakable even in plain clothes. He walked toward Alana, his boots sounding heavier than they should against the old diner floor. When he stopped, he wasn't looking at the men, he was looking at her. And for the first time that morning, she lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes. It was then Harris saw what no one else seemed to notice. Peeking out from beneath her rolled-up sleeve was a faded ink marking, worn but still clear. A unit tattoo. The kind of tattoo only soldiers bore. The kind they carried as permanent. Reminders of battles fought and brothers lost. His breath caught as he recognized it instantly. It was his unit. His eyes widened, and suddenly, the scars weren't just scars. They weren't the marks of tragedy that these men mocked. They were the badges of sacrifice, of service, of survival. And the realization struck him like a thunderclap. This wasn't just a waitress. This woman had once worn the same uniform he had. She had stood on the same battlefields, under the same flag, carrying the same weight of war. The men kept laughing, unaware of the storm about to hit them. But Harris was done being silent. He turned, his voice booming across the diner like a drill sergeant on parade. "Do you fools even realize who you're talking to?" The laughter faltered. A few customers gasped. The leader frowned, shifting in his seat. "What's your problem, old man?" he asked, trying to sound amused but failing to hide the uncertainty creeping into his tone. Harris pointed to Alana's arm. "That mark you're mocking. That's no accident. That's the tattoo of the 92nd Infantry Division. The Buffalo Soldiers. She earned that. Those scars? They're not ugly. They're proof that she fought. For this country while cowards. Like you sat safe at home. The diner erupted in murmurs. Eyes widened, jaws dropped. Suddenly, the narrative had flipped, and the men who had been laughing now looked pale, their smugness cracking under the weight of the truth. Alana stood frozen, her chest rising and falling as the room turned its attention to her. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't asked for anyone to defend her. But Harris's words had broken the silence she had lived under for years. The businessman sputtered, trying to recover. That can't be true, one muttered. She's just a waitress. Harris stepped closer to them, his voice like thunder. She's a soldier, a hero, and you've been mocking her like she's nothing. He leaned down, his eyes burning. Men like her don't just serve. They save lives. Maybe even lives like yours. Silence followed. The kind of silence that weighs heavy and lingers long after words have been spoken. Alana felt her throat tighten, her hands trembling not from shame, but from something else, something she hadn't felt in years. Recognition. Respect. For the first time in a long time, she no longer felt invisible. And the businessmen, stripped of their arrogance, sat speechless, their laughter replaced by the cold realization that they had mocked not weakness, but strength greater than they could ever comprehend. The diner remained frozen in a silence so sharp it could cut glass. The men who had mocked Alana moments earlier now sat stiffly in their booth, their faces pale, their eyes darting nervously as the weight of Colonel Harris's words pressed down on them. The truth had shattered the illusion of their power. Their laughter, once loud and commanding, had been replaced by shame that clung to them like a shadow. Across the diner, Alana stood with her hands trembling against her apron. She had lived years carrying those scars quietly, enduring the stares, the whispers, the assumptions. She had never defended herself, never explained, because some wounds were too heavy to turn into stories for strangers. And yet, here she was, her truth exposed, not by her own voice, but by someone who had recognized her sacrifice. Colonel Harris turned back toward her, his weathered face softening. He gave her a small nod, one soldier to another, a silent salute that carried more meaning than 1,000 words ever could. Alana blinked rapidly, trying to hold herself steady. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen not her scars, but her strength. The murmurs in the diner grew louder. Patrons leaned over their tables, whispering in shock. Some shook their heads at the businessman in disgust. Others stole glances at Alana, guilt flickering in their eyes for having never questioned the assumptions they too had made. Finally, the leader of the businessmen cleared his throat, his arrogance gone. We didn't know, he stammered, his voice cracking. We didn't mean. But Harris cut him off with a glare sharp enough to silence him instantly. You didn't care to know, he thundered. And that's the problem. You saw scars and thought weakness. You saw her skin and thought less. Men like you sit in comfort and mock those who bled for the very freedoms you take for granted. She fought while you laughed. She suffered while you prospered. And even now, you can't bring yourselves to truly apologize. The words hung in the air like a gavel striking judgment. One of the businessmen lowered his gaze, his shame too heavy to bear. Another shifted in his seat, clearly wanting to vanish into the floor. The leader swallowed hard, but whatever excuse he had died on his lips. And then something unexpected happened. From a corner booth, an elderly woman stood, her hands trembling as she leaned on her cane. She raised her voice, clear and steady despite her age. I lost my husband in that same division, she said. Her eyes locked onto Alana. Thank you. For your service. The diner erupted, not in laughter, but in applause. One by one, people rose to their feet, clapping, nodding, some with tears in their eyes. Strangers who had never spoken to Alana before now looked at her with awe and respect. Alana stood frozen, her throat tight, her chest heaving as the sound washed over her. Applause. Not pity. Not mockery. Respect. Her scars, once a source of shame, had become symbols of honor in that moment. The businessmen sat hunched, their humiliation complete. They had come in with loud voices and laughter, and now they sat in silence, dwarfed by the dignity of the woman they had tried to belittle. Colonel Harris leaned closer to Alana, his voice low but firm. "Never let them define you by your scars," he said. "They're not marks of weakness. They're proof you endured what others could not." Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Thank you." And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to stand a little taller, her shoulders squaring, her chin lifting. Not because she wanted recognition, but because she finally felt seen. As the applause faded, the diner returned to a quiet hum. But nothing was the same. People approached her table, some offering words of gratitude, others simply placing a hand over their heart. The businessmen slipped out, their heads bowed, fleeing before the weight of their shame could crush them further. And Alana, scarred, mocked, but now recognized, returned to her work with steady hands. Yet every step she took, every plate she carried with it a new strength. She wasn't invisible anymore. Her scars told a story, and now the world finally knew it.